Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the traditional traditional, if I might call it, after a year, more than a year now, a meeting of the Digital Events Committee of the Victorian Research. Victorians. I just got too excited. I'm sorry, I forgot the name of the Research Society for Victorian Periodicals, of course, like everyone, as everyone knows. These events are organized by the Digital Events Committee. We are 6 people. There is Kari Newman, who has been very helpful with organization of digital Zoom and everything. Matt Polland, Katie Birch, Surav Chatterjee, if I'm pronouncing, I hope, correctly, and Kriti Joshi, and myself, of course. So today we have very interesting speakers with very interesting topics. We will start with, we will talk about art in periodicals today, mostly lithography, but not only. And we will expand our geographical focus as well, which I think is going to be very interesting for all of us. If we are still on that. So we are going to start with Hala Auji. She's an, I'm sorry, I mispronounced it. Hala is an associate professor of art history and Hamad bin Khalifa Endowed Chair for Islamic Art at Virginia Commonwealth University. And she's also the author of recently published Printing Arab Modernity, Book Culture and the American Press in 19th Century Beirut. Her talk will cover illustrated 19th century Arabic periodicals published in Egypt and Ottoman Syria. I will leave the ground to Hala, and then we'll continue with our next speaker, Tom Young.
Thank you so much, Ali, for the introduction. And I'm just going to start sharing my screen before I say anything else. I also want to thank everyone for the Kari and Kriti and others for the invitation to speak. As part of this series. I'm hoping that this will give me, I think this is the first time I present this material to people who are not explicitly working in art history, but also in, Middle Eastern studies. And so it's going to be, I'm hoping, very beneficial to me. This material is actually coming from a book chapter that's coming out in an edited volume that I co-edited, and it's coming out in a couple weeks, hopefully. But it relates to my broader project. So any feedback I get will be useful for future projects. And so today I'm going to be talking about, well, first of all, my book that Ali mentioned, it's not recently published. I feel like it's been out forever, since 2016. And it's like, oh, that was so long ago. And the material that I work on, funnily enough, is actually not lithographed. It's all engravings. Very few lithographed examples exist in some of these volumes that I look at. So that will be an interesting thing to think about in comparison to the work that Tom does, and think about like colonial presses and how they differ across different regions. But essentially, I'm going to speak about my my ongoing research on 19th century illustrated periodicals. And really, before I delve into that, though, I always like to kind of situate us in case people aren't familiar with the geography or with the regional history. So unlike the publishing industry in the global north, the popularity of printed imagery in the Ottoman spheres only really became significant during the long 19th century, with illustrated periodicals really gaining traction in about I would say, the last 4 decades of that century. So Beirut in Ottoman Syria and the Egyptian cities of Cairo and Alexandria, which Egypt was under British occupation from around 1882 to about World War I, but before then it or during that time, it was more or less informally connected to the Ottoman Empire. These sites became increasingly important cultural centers with the emergence of private publishing industries, as well as museums, cultural organizations, and a lot of universities started to open up there, a lot of Western universities in the late 19th century. So all of this really contributed to notable intellectual change amongst Arabic-speaking communities living in these sort of provinces of the Ottoman world. And although the earliest examples of Arabic printing in the region date to about 1600 to mid 1700s, the publishing industry in Beirut and Cairo only really takes off in the mid to late 19th century. And this is really when a lot of state and a lot of private presses were established. And this is a period that I typically work on, and my book was really focused on that particular period. So the material that we'll be looking at today is really a few snippets, nothing major, but there's like some snippets from my chapter in the forthcoming volume that I co-edited on popular entertainment in the Middle East during the late 19th century to about the early 20th century. My contribution in this volume really considers the visual dimensions of the early illustrated Arabic periodicals that were published amongst Arabic-speaking communities in the Ottoman world, with a specific focus on Cairo, Alexandria, and Beirut. But this type of, these types of presses and publications were also very popular in Istanbul, and Damascus, and Baghdad. It's just that I'm focusing on a few cities and a few of these journals. The book itself is important because it takes up a serious consideration of the significance of something called the Arab Nahda. Nahda translates to Renaissance in Arabic, a movement for Arabic-speaking audiences and for popular audiences in specific. Now, the Nahda is typically understood as a cultural movement but that took place over the course of the long 19th century, depending on who you ask. And it emerges in response to wider Ottoman modernization reforms. It's often described as a period of intellectual change, where there were assessments being made about language, where you start to get an interest in journalistic writing. A lot of dictionaries are produced. There's also an interest in new forms of literature, serialized novels, popular fiction, culture, and knowledge were really gaining popularity amongst educated Arabic-speaking residents of the Ottoman cities. And in the field of Nahda studies, and it's become a field in more recent years, the Nahda is typically understood as an elite movement, as something that was limited to a specific educated class. What our volume does, I would say for the very first time, is that it challenges this assumption by considering the various roles that Nahda period productions like theater, illustrated periodicals, and popular fiction played in the realm of popular entertainment, like through secondhand exposure to a lot of this material. So to look at some of the stuff that I work on, so by the 1870s, you start to see an emergence of illustrated literary scientific journals, and a lot of presses open up and establish themselves around these specific journals. So some of the journal names are actually also the names of the actual presses themselves. And they gain, very quick popularity. It's not clear if it's because there's a lot of subscribers to these journals, or it's just a lot of people wanted to produce their own journal. It's known, and it's usually a joke amongst Middle Eastern publishing historians that these journals were not very successful financial ventures. Maybe of the ones I'm showing you here, the one on the furthest left, Al-Muqtataf, or the selections, is one that kept going until the 1950s. But all of the others, they last maybe 1 or 2 years, they last a few years, they don't last very long. It was a very difficult type of venture to go into, but that didn't stop the publishers from being super ambitious about the kind of work that they wanted to put out there. And Middle Eastern scholars often refer to these publications as literary scientific because of their scope. They covered so many seemingly unrelated topics, from medicine to literature to home economics to the latest fashion trends, It's sort of all over the place when you look at some of these journals, but really what one can say they did is that they demonstrated a view of the sciences and the arts as being interconnected, universal fields of inquiry. But although, historians really recognize these periodicals as important markers of regional perspectives on modernity, and they use their content, their textual content, a lot in their research. They serve as important primary documents. We still have a lot to learn about the significance of engraved images that featured in these publications. So often, when some of these articles get reproduced in more recent years, or when scholars reference these journals, they never make mention of any of the illustrations that appear in these journals, which I find very interesting. And it says something about what we value as historians when it comes to primary source material. So in my work, I really focus on how these illustrations were engaging middle-class and everyday audiences in visual and conceptual experiences pertaining to knowledge, spectacle, and art. So engravings become really important fixtures in these Arabic journals. Not a lot of them, like per issue, you have about maybe the most you would have is 5, but they're significant images, and that they take up an entire page. You can tell that there's been attention paid to selecting and including these images. And they were, like their articles, they were not really limited to a specific genre at all. Renderings included portraits, monuments, flora, fauna, scientific diagrams, and really any conceivable topic of interest from this period. And these journals were made a combination of imagery accessible to popular audiences, which I would argue that they would not really have been able to see otherwise in the context of the Ottoman sphere. And so although photography, art galleries, museums, panoramas, and world expos were available to many of Europe's urban and even rural publics, this was not necessarily the case for people living in Ottoman Egypt and Syria at the time. For many of these regions, non-elite publics, reproductions of photographs, of paintings, and other visual material were the closest that they were going to get to the original objects or to the context. So these engravings also all relate to, you really get a sense of what the interests of the Arabic publishers were. And it's important to say that these Arabic publishers saw themselves as public scholars. They were public authors, and they believed they were performing a public service for the public benefit of society in the interest of social reform and social progress. So they really wanted to engage a wide readership, from educated middle-class generalists to everyday, often illiterate audiences. And printed images, I argue, played a central role for these publishers as new modes of entertainment in order to sell these journals, right? But also as new ways of thinking and learning through visual media. So new forms of visual literacy and teaching. And I'm going to focus just on a few examples. There's just way too many to cover, even in this one chapter that I published. But mainly, so we have diagrams. A lot of these journals, regardless of whether they're leaning more scientifically or not, they often include diagrams. And the diagrams themselves, both the ways that they were produced, but also what they are demonstrating, they vary widely. It seems extremely random sometimes when you're looking at some of these journals. Many really focused on microscopic imagery, so sort of making visible what is typically invisible to the naked eye. And so you often have figures showing the way that light passes through the microscope, like the image that you see on the left, or you actually have, for instance, photo engravings that are trying to describe lightning by capturing electric sparks on the plate through photo engravings, which is what you see on the right. And through these diagrams, the journal editors were really interested in facilitating the navigation of complex material for readers, to whom this information was not only unfamiliar and novel, but also quite esoteric. And for readers without access to laboratory equipment or anything like that, these diagrams also introduced readers to the visual possibilities of the microscope for the very first time. Some of these illustrations also really emphasize the novelty of the diagrams themselves, which I think is, really interesting. So there's an article, for instance, on the telephone from 1876 that includes a textual description at the very beginning, explaining how the image can be used to help the pen describe the telephone's makeup and bring the mind closer to an understanding of its meaning or the workings of something that you typically cannot see. Editors were also committed to separating what they saw as fact from fiction, and more specifically avoiding or refuting any views of the world that didn't conform to their understanding of what was modern and specifically Western knowledge. So what I found really interesting is that despite their supposed scientific objectivity, a lot of these illustrations, were likely viewed and misunderstood in many ways, and belong to the broader experiences in this period in an era of subjective perception. Scholarship on visuality and perception, such as work by Jonathan Crary and others during the 19th century, has shown how modernity's excessive visual stimuli exposes viewers to reception and distraction. This scholarship speaks to the mobility of the visual experience, whereby mass-made images are abstracted from any founding site or referent. So through everyday experiences of mass media, spectators experience an overlap of multiple visual forms from uncertain and unstable perspectives. For the Arabic journals, this is really true of a lot of the visual renderings of space, and there's a lot of them. A lot of renditions of sort of celestial bodies from a variety of views. So it's not just about showing people like how the moon or the earth revolves around the sun, like you see in the center image, but also really thinking about what planets and the sun look like from different angles or from different distances. So one example that actually gets reproduced in a lot of different journals is the image that you see on the left. And this one is specifically from an 1877 report on astronomer Asa Paul's detection that year of one of Mars's two moons. And the caption reads, "Mars at its furthest, intermediary, and closest distance." When it appears in other issues of other journals, the caption changes. Suddenly it's Earth that's being depicted. It's really interesting to see how they reuse a lot of this imagery in different journals. But one of the examples that I really like is the one that you see on the right. And it really eerily sort of depicts a view of Earth from the moon. And the moon's sort of imagined topography really captured in this image is compounded by this sort of insurmountable impossibility of anyone experiencing this view at this time. So one can imagine how seeing these things with their very unstable perspectives really ruins the observer's sense of certainty about their experience of the world and their place in it. And this is despite the fact that the articles themselves are continuously trying to ground their analysis in empiricism. It's interesting to think about how a lot of this stuff was also being misunderstood by viewers. Engravings also illustrated what publishers considered to be exotic flora and fauna, many of them foreign to the Levantine landscape, like the American condor, vulture, or zebras. Many engravings also captured subject matter that was popular amongst global audiences at the time, such as renditions of latest technologies. Like here in the image on the right, you're seeing a person using a stereoscope. There's also a lot of images of how the camera works, telegrams, and many other types of technologies that are really being featured for the first time and seen for the first time in these journals. Some of the journals dealt with spectacle, and specifically the kind of spectacles that you would see at world fairs. A lot of performers are depicted, a lot of people wearing different costumes, and really a lot of the stuff is very often included a very Orientalist and very colonialist understanding of cultures and society. And this imagery also frequently depicted ethnic or racialized others. So this image, these two images, for instance, come from a journal published in Beirut in 1871. It includes engravings of African-American performers Millie and Christine McCoy, who were born conjoined at the pelvis and sold into slavery at birth, and they lived their lives forced to perform on various global stages. What I found very interesting about these stylized renderings is that I couldn't really trace where the engraver may have, like, what image the engraver may have been looking at. But most likely it was British reproductions of photographs and not photographs themselves. But what I found was particularly interesting is how the kind of liberties the engraver was taking. That says a lot about the journal's and the publisher's intent, but also how they were utilizing these engravings to get certain responses from their audience. So in the image on the right, for instance, it's supposed to show the back of the performers, and unlike what you see on the front, where they're dressed wearing, there's two bodices, a single skirt, and boots. In the image on the right, they appear to be topless, and the skirt, it looks completely different, and they're barefoot. And so you see, it's interesting, like this particular comparison, it really shows the sexualization and racialization of female performers. And you really see this in relationship to other non-white individuals and social groups. And in fact, it's extremely common in Arabic periodicals at this time, particularly the ones that were being published in Egypt. There was also an interest in popularizing the value of the fine arts. And I would argue that this is not only seen in articles on the fine arts, but also in the introduction of portraiture, of printed portraiture in these journals. So mass-produced portraits of local and foreign figures from across time become increasingly popular by the late 1800s in these particular journals. And many of these portraits, like this one of Madame de Staël, were actually copied from steel engravings printed in the US or Europe that themselves were copied from 18th century painting. But what's interesting about the Arabic version is that there's no reference to the original source, like unlike the steel engraving that really goes into detail. The Arabic references, that there's no references at all. They kind of, they're reproduced by local engravers who include an inscription that is their name, but they don't tell you where these images are coming from. The popularity of printed portraiture was also informed by the socio-political importance of this genre within and beyond imperial Ottoman circles. So while in imperial context, portrait paintings and photographs were becoming increasingly popular during the 19th century, these images were not typically circulated locally. They may be circulated abroad as sort of diplomatic gifts, but locally, amongst everyday audiences, these images rarely were seen. And this is also due to the fact that regionally, there were not a lot of public art galleries, and whatever museums existed were more interested in archaeology, not in art with a capital A. So it was really through journal articles and these journal portraits, and I refer to them as printed galleries, that mass audiences were able to appreciate and engage with this artistic genre. And this genre, of course, at this time was gaining a lot of popularity within the realm of photography, especially with developments of the sort of portable Kodak camera, and suddenly everybody can get their portrait taken. Really, they're looking at portraiture as an art form or portraiture of key individuals. It only was taking place on the pages of these particular journals. Now, what I've noticed that a lot of these illustrations in these Arabic journals have in common is that they really circulated in and through transnational networks amongst engravers, publishers, and presses. And it's been difficult to trying to trace on these networks. But the more I look at these images, the more I try to read between the lines when there's references being made in these articles, the more I noticed that it's clear that these presses had illustrated volumes in front of them that they were looking at, but also these engravings move across different presses. So there seems to be some sort of networks that were in place that are not very easy to discern without further research. But given the political and social connections that presses and their owners had to markets and publishing industries in France, Britain, and North America at the time, it's not surprising that most of the articles in these journals were translated from different languages, and that the engravings themselves would also be translated, although very few scholars talk about that. They talk about the translation of text, but they don't talk about the translation of images. And so it's really interesting to think about how this was taking place, who these individuals are. And although there's a lot of research recently on late 19th century artists as painters and photographers, there's no research on these types of engravers and the kind of training that they could have received, who they were, what their lives were like. And that's something I'm trying to work on in my book that focuses on portraiture, and it's using the illustrated press as a resource. But I would also argue that it's not simply about Arab publishers wanting to copy or mimic Western sources. Rather, the publishers really viewed themselves very highly, and they saw themselves as participants in contemporaneous global capitalist interests in issues of social reform, technological change, urbanization, and industrialization. And we can really see this in how some images appear almost at the same time across different regions in completely different publications. And so in the case of the journal that I've been studying, the image of Alexander Graham Bell testing his phone and some of the diagrams are the same ones that appear in Scientific American the year before, but then a year after the journal, the Arabic article is published, you also see the same diagrams appearing in Popular Science Monthly in London. So I'm not saying that they're all necessarily like in contact with each other, but you could see that there is a clear and meaningful engagement on the part of the Arabic publishers to really bring the latest ideas forward, but also these engravers were copying and creating these plates at the same time. And so there's the sense of time is really important to consider. And so, to sort of end here, I'd like to say that, we can really only conjecture how the regional public, viewed or interacted with or even appreciated or even understood these images. But the simultaneous presence of various modes of representation, different modes of printing techniques, which I didn't really talk about, but I can answer some questions about, and the different ways of seeing or reading across these journals that were circulating regionally at the same time, it might have really made for a very disjointed, although very amusing visual experience, on par with visuality in the age of modernity. So in that sense, one can locate these journals as part of transcultural aesthetic practices related to global popular entertainment at this time. With that, I would also like to say that, I'm really interested in hearing thoughts from everyone who's here, but also really to see how Tom's work, differs from or relates to the work that I've been doing, to see whether there are similar examples that one sees in publications from colonial India. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Hala. A round of applause for this excellent, very interesting presentation. And before we take questions, we'll continue with Tom's presentation. I will introduce Tom first, and then Tom Young is a lecturer in 19th century art histories at the Courtauld Institute of Art in London. And he is the author of This One Is Correctly and recently published, I'm making the East India Company, British art and political reform in colonial India, circa 1813 to 1858. Tom is going to speak about his current project on the 19th century global spread of lithography. I leave the ground to Tom. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm also coming from an extremely hot London, which is why all my blinds are down and I'm trying to stay cool. Just share my presentation. Okay, is that working for everybody? Yeah, brilliant. So this material, it's the basis of an article that's forthcoming, and it's really about lithography and a particular print format. But actually, as it turns out, much of this material was published in periodicals. So I'm quite excited to speak to the RSVP and see what experts in periodical culture can sort of provide, because I'm very much not an expert in periodical culture. I'm an art historian at heart. So over the first decades of the 19th century, a novel print portrait format achieved global popularity. The format combined a vignette of a sitter's likeness with a facsimile of their signature. Such facsimile autographed portraits created the impression that sitters had physically signed the print, seemingly authenticating the accuracy of the depiction, while also leaving an indexical trace of agency, of the sitter's physical agency. In the talk today, I'm going to explore how this format afforded a cogent way to conceptualize and communicate ideas about selfhood in liberal, romantic, and nationalist political programs. More specifically, I'm going to connect the format's international popularity to the global expansion of lithographic printing. Originally named after its ability to multiply marks made on stone, and that's the lithos. Lithography was invented in Bavaria in 1796-8 by Johann Alois Senfelder. That's him there on the left. Technology possessed several intrinsic qualities that spurred the production and consumption of autographed print portraits across Europe, Asia, the Americas, and colonial Africa and Australasia. First, it was financially, physically, and technically accessible. Over the 50 years following its invention, presses grew ever cheaper, more portable, and more accessible to amateurs. Accordingly, medium liberated print culture from an earlier dependence on metropolitan investment and established traditions of technical and artistic expertise, and instead promoted the growth of print publics across so-called peripheral, provincial, and colonial territories. Second, the medium created exact facsimiles of original mark making. The mark you make onto the stone is what's printed, conferring greater authenticity on the signature as an indexical trace of the sitter's hand. Third, while alternative print processes were employed in the production of facsimile autographed portraits, and this is certainly true of more luxurious products, the fact that lithography easily incorporated both text and image onto the same flat printing surface enabled the technology to popularize the format across a range of media, including magazines, books, posters, sheet music, especially the burgeoning culture of illustrated periodicals. The core argument I want to get across today is that examining the international impact of political ideas through the history of lithographic printing better roots intellectual developments in the technological basis of modern globalization. So I'm not just going to argue that the facsimile autographed portrait encoded new ideas about self and society, but rather that lithography afforded a decentralization of illustrated literary culture that fundamentally reshaped the societies in which these ideas flourished. Concepts like the liberal self or the romantic self have become commonplaces in 19th century studies, and I quite like Lionel Trilling's remark that whoever's read any European history at all knows that the self emerges at pretty frequent intervals. So while avoiding any sort of discussion of the birth or the discovery of the self in this period, I do want to propose an alternative concept, thinking about what Sarah Blackwood has called the ever-evolving ways in which inner life has been represented through aesthetic form. And over two sections, the first tracing the facsimile autographed portrait's origins, and then the next its impact around the world, I'm going to argue that this selfhood might best be categorized as autographic. Okay, so the origins. The format had multiple origins and was anticipated in a range of visual and material practices, much like early photography. And there's an interesting side history of photography here, but I don't have time to go into it. Autographed likenesses clearly descended from the popular genre of illustrious heads, portraits of celebrated historical figures such as monarchs, generals, artists, and philosophers. By the 19th century, such prints were depicting contemporary celebrities and state officials like MPs or senators, reflecting shifting ideas about public life. In contrast, the addition of facsimile autographs to print portraiture invoked a more intimate craze for exchanging signatures and portrait sketches among close acquaintances, either in the long-established genre of friendship albums or less specialized manuscripts like scrapbooks and commonplaces. Soliciting entries in such objects crafted individual identity in relation to wider social networks, with signatures indexing and memorializing sentimental interactions. Nonetheless, the practice of autograph collecting had also been reconfigured over the 18th century through developments in antiquarianism. Private collections of illustrious figures' autographs, often framed or bound in albums with portraits, fragments of private letters, and even personal mementos like locks of hair, and you get all sorts of weird indexical traces added to these sorts of framed works, were increasingly conceptualized as explicating historical narratives through the material traces of exceptional lives. As these developments suggest, print series of illustrious heads, private albums of autographs, and the social practices associated with both had begun to converge in the decades before lithography's invention. Commercial albums featuring engraved facsimiles of individuals' handwriting were published for larger audiences towards the end of the 18th century, while between 1788 and 1793, the London-based publisher John Thane released British Autography, seemingly the first album to combine, quote, authentic portraits of royal and illustrious personages with engraved samples of the sitter's handwriting, added to the matrices using tracing paper. And this is intaglio work. If the facsimile autograph portrait was thus not dependent on the invention of lithography, the cheaper medium did promote more diverse, middle-class audiences, while also sparing the publication of facsimile autograph portraits in territories without established print industries. For example, over the 1850s, a periodical called La Ilustración Mexicana was published in Mexico City by the liberal reformer Francisco Zarco. The periodical paired autographed portraits of national heroes and rising literary stars with illustrated articles on literature, fashion, local customs, and scientific or economic information, all while lauding how lithography proved, quote, indispensable to illustrate such a varied text. The format equally featured in the India Review, a periodical published in Calcutta in the late 1830s by Dr. Frederick Corbin, a, quote, strenuous reformer and member of the East India Company's medical service. This publication not only included the lithographer Colesworthy Grant's facsimiles of Fraser's gallery of illustrious literary characters, and this is a series of autographed portraits that are released in the London-based periodical Fraser's magazine, but stated that these illustrations would, quote, throw out the hint to public men in Bengal. Such ambitions were met. Later issues featured signed portraits of doctors, lawyers, civil servants, and missionaries working in the colonial administration, all depicted with the signature's self-assertion of individuality. In a state with limited investment in or expertise in intaglio printing, lithography effectively ensured that a colonial periodical enjoyed illustration that was, to use the editor's own words here, not behind the artist in London. Lithography did more than expand the format's social and geographic reach, however. As mentioned earlier, chemical processes of transferring and replicating marks made onto paper, so you could write on paper and then that could be chemically transferred onto the stone, as well as simply writing onto the stone and then printing, erased the impact of the engraver's hand. As the photographer Philip Henry Delamarche wrote in 1849, planographic techniques meant that, quote, all intermediate assistance is dispensed with, the actual touches of the original artist are transferred and reproduced by the press with unerring fidelity. This quality resulted in the medium being employed on what French publishers called autography, the reproduction of handwritten documents such as circulars or invitations, sometimes menus, which communicated a sense of intimate personalization. And these sorts of things are used in politics to, you get some of the things today when politicians send you these fake handwritten letters to try and convince you about their vote. In a similar way, the absence of the engraver's manual intervention amplified the effective appeal of a format positioned between illustrious publicity and intimate sociability. With the signature typically just a forename and often preceded by a valediction such as yours sincerely, the format alluded to a personal, epistolatory relationship between the sitter, the artist, and the viewer. This appeal was heightened through the distinct aesthetic of the lithographic vignette. In the early modern period, engraved series of illustrious heads had typically reflected an association between copperplate engraving and antique medals, coins, and funerary monuments. With portraits in classicizing architectonic frames, contained in ovals reminiscent of antique medals, or depicted literally as sculptural busts, portraits deployed an analogy between engraving and antiquity's fragmentary remains, thereby legitimizing the illustriousness of sitters through the supposed weight of historical significance and figuring fame as a trans-historical public renown. In contrast, the evident speed of lithographic mark-making evoked a conception of fame was more ephemeral, of the moment. The lithographic vignette was almost always detached from an architectonic surround, and its expeditious character evoked a portrait sitting from life, recording quick sketches produced for friendship albums. Series such as Fraser's Gallery of Illustrious Literary Characters, the series we mentioned earlier, made conscious use of such allusions, with its hasty ad vivum line drawings reinforcing the series' overarching conceit, having an insider draw on their intimacy with various literary celebrities to reveal insights about private characters. Accordingly, the format constructed celebrity according to a distinctly modern strategy that Tom Mole has called the hermeneutic of intimacy, whereby an emphasis on a reader's supposed capacity to engage personally or effectively with a real author negated the increased estrangement of audiences under print capitalism. The popularity of the format thus not only seems a result of lithography diversifying literary publics, but because the signed portrait encapsulated a fundamental tenet of the middle classes who both consumed and were enfranchised by the proliferation of print media. This was the idea that modern societies grew out of the increased participation of individuals in a discursive civil society, primarily through the rapid expansion of literacy, new communication technologies, and press liberties. The ideas of sitters signing their own likenesses evoked private bodies affirming ownership of their public personae, drawing attention to the complex dynamic between the physical body, the manual act of writing, and a literary sphere based on mechanical reproduction. For example, a lithograph of Johann Christian Dulz, a teacher at the prestigious Radfrischule in Leipzig, accompanied the sitter's likeness with a facsimile reproduction of a signed, handwritten fragment of his philosophy. In doing so, the format pictured Dulz according to an ideal conception of the modern liberal subject, as a private individual who actively entered into public life and thereby asserted their individuation in the discursive public sphere. The autographed portrait essentially signified a sitter's self-assertion of individuality more effectively than an artist's traditional depiction of their unique physical likeness. And it's interesting at this period too, you have an interest in literary magazines, an interest in the physiognomy of handwriting as well, which is something that's, I don't have time to go into, but there's an idea that somehow part of you is expressed in your writing in this period. It is consequently unsurprising that the format typically appeared in albums or print series that sought to portray a sociable equality between middle-class members of political clubs, scientific societies, or corporate bodies like stockholders and trustees. It encapsulated the notion of unique, private individuals entering into equitable forms of public life, particularly when portraits were serialized. As international middle classes adopted global uniformities in body practices like dress and facial grooming, the signature came to mediate the visual conformity of middle-class belonging by indexing the notion of a unique inner will that underpinned this class's claims to social and political enfranchisement. For instance, a British series of 60 portraits of honorary members of the Ipswich Museum combined portraits expressive of a uniform visual decorum with the signature's unique trace of agency. A print from 1850 had 5 celebrated English chemists in homogeneous suits about a table, their signatures testifying to an individuality that the image belied. Such imagery demonstrates how the format was capable of expressing and possibly even stabilizing the dynamics of liberal selfhood, indexing the private body in its unique inner volition, while simultaneously picturing the public self and its democratic conformance with civic norms. And it's interesting, these were produced after daguerreotypes. So there's this history of photography that I'm happy to take questions on. If the format was felicitous in capturing such ideals, it was also capable of expressing how liberal notions of civic participation were mitigated by physical, sexual, and cultural differences. For instance, a portrait of the Haitian revolutionary Toussaint Louverture, included in François Delpech's 1832 edition of his L'iconographie des contemporains, granted the signature sitter the same self-assertion of individuality as the album's other print portraits, yet arguably exaggerated his facial features according to racist stereotypes about physiognomy. Similarly, it's notable that the majority of facsimile autograph portraits depicted men. Albums of women's illustrious heads were produced in this period, yet rarely featured facsimile signatures. By excluding women from a format capable of expressing how the pictured body might actively enter into discursive forms of public life. For those exceptional women who did participate in the literary sphere, visual qualities like costume or physiognomy mediated the tensions resulting from female public renown. For instance, Neil Maclise's facsimile autograph portrait of the political activist Harriet Martineau, published in 1833 as part of Fraser's Gallery, critiqued the author's supposedly unnatural place in public life using visual signifiers associated with witchcraft, while additionally just juxtaposing the author's quill and inkwell with consciously domestic and feminine paraphernalia for serving tea. If the facsimile autograph portrait was thus particularly felicitous at capturing middle-class ideas about liberal individuality, such ideas should be considered inseparable from the various strategies by which people were denied or received mitigated recognition of their agency on the basis of racial, cultural, and sexual difference. Usefully, lithography offers a unique way to interrogate this history, because the technology flourished within the trans and inter-imperial networks of European empires, catalyzing public spheres with evident racial and ethnic boundaries, and spurring the production of signed portraits in context shaped by colonial governance and romantic nationalist insurrection. And in this next section, I'm going to explore how the signed portraits reveal how new media technologies both exported political concepts and then enabled their reinvention across the early 19th century world. So the facsimile autograph portrait definitely shifted between representing an exceptional individuality to exhibiting that individual's embeddedness in a distinct community, as denoted through physiognomy, costume, or gesture. This gave the format a powerful capacity to negotiate the construction of racial difference in colonial societies, where the medium enjoyed the additional advantage of being able to reproduce scripts unsuited to fixed type. Colonial capitals such as Calcutta witnessed the growth of a multilingual lithographic culture for periodicals, satirical pamphlets, and illustrated books, which in turn underpinned the making of the city's Bengali and British middle classes. In this new cultural field, publications of facsimile autograph portraits mediated the racial ambivalencies of the company's liberal-driven policies of Anglicization, while also asserting the self-identification of middle-class colonial officials as both masculine and white. These developments are exemplified in a series of portraits called Rough Sketches of Oriental Heads, which were published in various Calcuttan periodicals over the 1830s by the lithographer Colesworthy Grant, in concert with those portraits in the India Review that I was discussing earlier. The latter had portrayed exclusively white, male officials asserting their place in Bengal's public life. Oriental Heads reflected a far more complex array of claims to individuality, agency, and typicality, each of which entailed various intensities of violence from the colonial state. For instance, Ranganachi Monohurdos, Gujarati merchant of Bombay, was depicted as an enfranchised member of the middle-class merchant community, his autograph transferred in Devanagari characters. In contrast, a double portrait of unnamed labourers presented the sitters as representatives of an ethnographic type, with only the caption of the Dangur tribe, natives of Nagpur. At times, its overarching strategy of discriminating between individuality and typicality was crystallized in a single print. Grant's portraits of coolies, a derogatory term for indentured and often coercively transported labourers, presented the sitters as amid shipping crates, creating a blunt metaphor for the presumed fungibility of non-white bodies in Britain's imperial economy. Each of the crates detailed a proprietorial name distinguishing members of Calcutta's flourishing economic and literary sphere, including a publisher who re-released Oriental Heads. In doing so, the print presented the social divide between unfree labour and the middle-class literary public this coercive economy supported, as determined by the ability to actively signify individuality in writing. Accordingly, Grant's coolies were made to epitomize this individuality's other, a typehood categorized by race, geography, and religion, with printed type precisely opposite of that romantic, embodied form of handwriting afforded by lithographic facsimiles. As the signature crystallized liberal ideas about agency, consent, and the relation of the physical body to the public sphere, lithographic facsimiles of autographs enable colonial portraiture to visualize which subjects had the capacity to assert individuality or to demand public recognition, and thus mediated the biopolitics of bare life. Similar issues attend an autographed portrait of an Aboriginal man named Maranwali, who adopted the name Charles Never. Born near the Lower Murray River in the settler colony of New South Wales, Maranwali received an English education at Merry Creek Aboriginal School. His portrait was published in the Illustrated Australian magazine, a periodical that, like some of the other periodicals we've heard, only had a short run between 1850 and 1852, but shared the liberal political ambitions and interests of both La Ilustración Mexicana and the India Review. The print was taken after an 1850 sketch by William Strutt, by which the artist had solicited autographs of Maranwali's English and Aboriginal names and stated that these were, quote, written by himself. I think the resulting lithograph raises intensely difficult questions about the extent to which Maranwali consented to being pictured, whether he approved of the image, and whether he would have responded favorably to its broader dissemination. Given his archivally documented strategy of self-fashioning through European clothing, it's quite possible that he conceptualized signing his own names as an act of self-assertion, associating sartorial practices with a capacity to express the interiority and agency motivating these choices within an English language public sphere. At the same time, it's clear that his inclusion in the Illustrated Australian magazine was dependent on a majority of the periodical's readership interpreting his anglicized identity as what Homike Baba has called an authorized version of otherness, assuaging anxieties about colonial mimicry by foregrounding the supposedly liberal and improving effects of English literacy. And this is particularly in a context where the word is the word of God, and English language education is specifically Christian education. The facsimile signature likely materialized competing interests, revealing how ideas about racial difference determine the scope of individuals to actively shape the public recognition of their agency or autonomy. Importantly, the format's ability to communicate a self-assertive individuality and evidence of that agent's embeddedness in a linguistic or ethnic community afforded strategies for producing and mobilizing a politics of inclusion, particularly as European national movements sought to break away from the continent's old empires. In 1828, the Bavarian publisher Franz Hanfstaengl released a portrait series of figures involved in the Greek War of Independence, depicting revolutionaries such as Theodoros Kolokotronis in distinctly national attire. A similar series, published in London in 1825-6 by the Danish volunteer soldier Adam Friedel, collated portraits of lionized Greek revolutionaries such as Ioannis Mavromichalis and Papaflessus, each in distinctive clothing and with their signatures transferred in the Greek alphabet. Presenting revolutionaries as both visually characteristic and as consciously signing their individuality in a national script, cogently captured the association between language and national identity in romantic nationalist agendas. Autograph prints associated the self-assertive connotations of the facsimile signature with a more nebulous idea of the agentic national spirit, extrapolating to the community the liberal model of an autonomous individual receiving individuation in the public sphere. This use of the format seemingly contrasts with its more typical application in portraying middle-class conformity. And in fact, these sorts of prints even suggest they represent a backlash to that sort of middle-class egalitarianism. Nevertheless, the Romantic hero was a phenomenon just as much tied to the global expansion of middle-class literary culture as the growth of liberal ideas about selfhood, as illustrations of revolutionaries fighting for national autonomy were marketed to a transnational public of liberal middle-class sympathizers. I'll cut this bit because I'm aware of the time. So I'll come to the point where I say the ability of the autograph to evoke for anonymous audiences an impression of personalization and thereby reduce the gap between the artist and their public, the heroic individual and their supporters, is epitomized in a print of Hungary's national hero, Lajos Kossuth, let's skip Byron, which used a signature transferred from a private letter to enable the portrait to address Kossuth's English-speaking admirers with an intimate, yours most sincerely. So to conclude, instead of charting how the facsimile autograph format reflected various liberal, romantic, or nationalist ideas about selfhood, it seems more appropriate to highlight the links between intellectual history and the development of popular media technologies. Facsimile autograph portraiture promoted an expression of selfhood that might best be described as autographic, as it was premised on a signature's capacity to index an assertion of bodily autonomy, and thus tethered to a unique private person, a public image manufactured and marketed through mechanical reproduction. To this day, remarkably similar forms of imagery continue to proliferate across a globalized media environment, in which the self-assertion of inner volition indexed by the lithographic signature has been replaced by the ease of digital self-publication. I have an example from Ed Paul's. And the increasingly rapid decentralization of public culture initiated through technologies like lithography has persisted in fragmenting and devaluing the normative bourgeois account of a unified space for rational discourse. Websites such as Wikipedia, most biographical entries continue to feature an info box containing both a visual portrait and a facsimile autograph, while the signature remains essential for validating photographic documentation like passports and driving licenses, where, as with the facsimile autograph, print intrinsically ties the visual likeness to a person's physical body, their self-assertion of individuality, and their personal approval of the likeness. As the capacity of artificial intelligence to generate imagery progresses, it will undoubtedly catalyze new debates over the most appropriate strategies for authenticating visual likenesses and linking portrait imagery to the agency and active consent of the person depicted. For now, though, I'd argue we continue to live with the visual conventions and conceptual legacies first popularized by lithographs of the autographic self. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. This was a journey, really. Was very interesting, and we can have some questions. I'm sure there are so many, but let's see if we have some questions.
And I just want to quickly pop in and say that we can go, if people need to leave, they can, but if our two speakers will stay a little bit, we typically tend to go 15, 20, 30 minutes over. So
well, I mean, I just want to maybe get us started off. It's so lovely seeing your presentation, hearing about your work, Tom, and I mean, if afterwards you could send me a link to the coming article or when it's coming out so I can look for it. I think I really appreciated the way in which you were kind of looking at these lithographs and looking at how they were being copied from other imagery as well, and seeing that journey that they made, and also in connection to the signature, something that I've been looking at some of these lithographs and some of my research on portraiture, but I didn't think about that signature in that way that you framed it. But I also think it's really interesting, and some of the material I showed today touches on it in some way, but a lot of the research that I'm looking at that I didn't bring in also relates a lot to what was going on in some of the images that you were showing, and so to think about the role of portraiture on a global scale and the way it was being altered within the popular media, as opposed to the kind of focus that we place on it in the context of painting and then photography. I think in that way your work and my work dovetails very nicely. And yeah, I mean, I feel like there's, I learned a lot from the presentation, is what I want to say.
Yeah, I think that definitely that's interesting where these images are coming from, because although the lithographs often look like original sketches, they are often based on other imagery, and it's more so it's an aesthetic of the sketch rather than them actually being from life drawings. So yeah, I'm trying to work out where this imagery is coming from, and people like Frederick Corbin in Calcutta, he's constantly talking about trying to get imagery from Britain so that he can incorporate it into the periodical. So there's definitely similarities there with your material.
And I like the sketchiness of the vignettes, and it kind of like troubles this notion that, about the fixity of print, right? Like we often think print sort of as being stabilized, and the hand drawn or the handwritten as really being what captures the trace of the artist. But here, with the lithographs that you're showing, it really problematizes and kind of unsettles these ways of looking at print.
So if you want to say something, Tom, continue. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I totally agree that yeah, there's this sort of rhetoric of the sketch with lithography, because that's sort of that's part of its appeal.
Can I pop in with a question that is not a periodical question, but maybe that will come in. So, and I think it connects Tom and Hala's work. So, Tom, I was fascinated by the sort of signatures that you talk about, which is the signatures of the sitters. But there's another signature on all of these images. And that is, of course, the signature of the lithographer, which you didn't talk about. And Hala, I noticed in your illustrations, most of them, and they were going, but most of them didn't have signatures of the engravers, which is, of course, common, right? Engravers were seen as too they were not artistic enough, right? So sometimes you will have engraver signatures if the engraver's famous, like the Dalziels, for instance, but lots and lots of times you don't have engraver signatures. And so there's a part that I wonder if we can talk about sort of the technology, which often gets effaced, except when we're talking to art historians, the technology that is used for this mechanical reproduction, but its own sort of internal hierarchy, right? So the lithographer gets a signature, but the engraver doesn't. And so, Hala, you were saying, part of the work you want to do is draw attention to these engravers, which is sort of my own project too. And one of the things about it is it's really, really hard to find information about them because nobody has sort of written. So I just wonder if I could ask the two of you to sort of muse about sort of that other, not the signature of the liberal self, the sitter, Tom, as you're talking about, but in fact, the effaced signature, if you will, in the case of Hala's wood engravings of the laborer, the worker who is producing these images. That makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, Tom, do you want to take it first, or should I start?
You go ahead. That's
that's a great observation, Preeti. When it comes to, and as I was looking at Tom's presentation, I was like, yeah, signatures don't really make it into a lot of the images that I work with and I look at, and it's been extremely hard trying to even just figure out it's trying to decipher the actual names that are written, that are inscribed. They are spelled differently every time. But when after looking at, and one thing I should say that is that with Arabic periodicals, these haven't been OCR'd. You could use that as a verb, and they haven't really been indexed, so you can't tell what illustrations are in which periodicals when you're looking at the stuff online, and through digital databases. A lot of times there's no note as to whether it might say that something's illustrated, but you don't know how many illustrations are there. There's no names of engravers. So you have to literally go through every single one of these issues, trying to first figure out how many illustrations are in every single issue, but then try to see how many times an engraver's name appears. Now, after doing this for a few years, I've only come up with 2 names. So all this work, I feel like there's only been 2 names that keep popping up. And what's interesting is that they pop up in different journals, and journals that were being produced simultaneously in Cairo, Alexandria, in Beirut, and sometimes in Istanbul. So it's interesting. I know these people can't be at these places all at the same time. So it's interesting to think about how these engravings are moving, where these individuals were actually working, what kind of education they had. But what I could tell in relationship to when we're looking at those engravings and then trying to find announcements in the journals where the journal talks about the engravings themselves. And, Tom, you were mentioning how in Calcutta, there's been some of those publishers are having challenges acquiring imagery, acquiring engravings. A lot of the journals I'm looking at also have those challenges. And so they were constantly talking about how there's no local sources for these types of engravings and that they're acquiring a lot of the stuff from abroad. So it's interesting that there's never any mention of the actual engravers, and they are not cited there. And I mean, it has something to do with the lack of any kind of intellectual property laws at the time. But what's interesting, though, is that in Egypt, under British colonial rule by the late 19th century, when an image is borrowed from someone's collection and produced by someone specific, they will start to include that information. And so in one of the images, I didn't emphasize that when I spoke about it, but one of the portraits of a local Egyptian individual, that portrait, when it gets repeated, it always includes a little inscription at the bottom that says, this is taken from so-and-so's collection and was produced by so-and-so after photographed by so-and-so. That stuff that starts to emerge more during the early 20th century and specifically under British rule. So yeah, I mean, I guess that makes sense because the colonial apparatus was very much involved in a lot of these even local private presses. And I think questions of copyright start to become pertinent in Egypt at a time where they are not an issue in places like Beirut, which were at that time under Ottoman rule.
In terms of lithography, there's a whole hierarchy of hidden labor, because you don't just, I mean, it starts as a sort of a rhetoric of this allows artists to produce their own prints, and then very quickly becomes an industrial process where you have workshops and people doing the sketches on the stones, then people printing. And in places like Calcutta, when we're talking about Causeway Grant, you know, whether he's doing the drawing on the stone and then it's being printed by sort of unnamed South Asian laborers, whether there's that who are not on the who are not named, that's unclear at times. But then he could also be working on paper, and then that could be transferred by somebody else onto a lithographic stone. So there's a whole range of there's a whole hierarchy of hidden labor. I think when you have the signatures, often in some of these prints, it's often the artist's signature rather than the person who's printed it. And I think that adds into this idea of it being a sketch from life, that this is some, you know, it's a sketch that's been someone sat opposite, seen this living person. It adds to the rhetoric of liveliness that I think a lot of this lithographic portraiture has, that this is someone who's living, they're a contemporary celebrity. This is not some sort of, you know, tomb or monument to a historical personage. This is a living person who's been sketched. And then it also adds this another trace of agency onto the print. So emphasizing this idea of association, I think, as part of the rhetoric of these prints.
And I mean, if I can add just one more thing about the Arabic prints, I think is really important, is that the articles themselves, the author is not named. So you kind of can't guess who wrote a lot of these articles. You know they're translated, and sometimes they might say, oh, this is translated from the popular American journal, but it won't name the name of the author, it won't cite a date or anything like that. And you just kind of assume that these texts were written by the editors, by the publishers, because these were their projects. But the names of authors it's very difficult to also trace who authored specific texts, so it's not just about the images.
Thank you very much, both of you. We have a question in the chat from Jeline to Tom. First of all, fabulous, she says, fabulous presentation. And she would like to know the name of the person who originated hermeneutic intimacy.
That's Tom Mole. His book about Byron, it coins the term the celebrity apparatus. And I think it's a really useful way to think about the lithographic culture in contrast to, say, lens-based forms of celebrity, because the apparatus at the time is that these are images that are being published in literary periodicals, magazines. And so I think that's part of the reason why there's an interest in the signature, because these are being published in a literary culture where the name is significant, or potentially more significant than actually the representation. Tom Mole. M-O-L-E. I just saw the comment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So we have more questions. I think it was first Catherine who raised her hand.
Hi, thank you to both of you for these talks. I learned a lot. And we've been talking a lot about sort of authenticity and attribution and sort of the rhetoric of authenticity with these images. But I was struck that a connection between the two talks was actually views of things that are impossible. So in Tom's, that amazing portrait of the 5 scientists who clearly were not in the same room at the same time to create that image. And then with Hala, the view from the moon. And this idea of that balance between the authentic, but then also the completely, the joy of something that could not be seen in real life appearing in these engravings.
Yeah, I mean, it's I feel like the medium allows for that, right? And I too really enjoyed looking at Tom's the lithograph of those different, and I've seen things like it in some of the journals I'm looking at, but the group photo was really interesting. And trying to kind of bring these people into the same room, which would have been an impossibility. I mean, it's not just the technical element, but also like, conceptually, and what that means. And so there's, I find that the journals allowed for that, and the technology allowed for that, and the fluidity of what the technology meant was supposed to do. And also this view of perception that was very much in flux at the time. I think, like today, it's kind of like the photoshopped image or whatever. But I think it didn't have that sort of negative connotation necessarily. The artifice of it was not seen as a negative connotation, but rather a technological feat. Like through technology, we are able to do this, to bring this to life, right?
Yeah, and to add in, I think it's very much this, the thing that can't be visualized in these prints is the public, because it's this formation that has to be serial and open. And I think there's all different strategies of trying to visualize the public, and one of those is gathering people around the table. I don't know who was buying prints of, I mean, I love the idea that people are buying prints of like famous chemists, and I've gone through series albums of famous surgeons, weird, but but all with the same serialized with the lithographic signature, so they appear in a sort of uniform way, but as a public. It's an attempt to visualize something that is quite conceptual, but emerging in the sort of literary culture at the time, ideas about the public, and that's very common in the periodicals where these prints are, that this is talking about appeal to the public, and that will the public support this fledgling periodical as it tries to make its way in colonial Australia or something like this. So
thank you very much. I'd like to just add on the public for scientific orthographies and orthographs in the 19th century. During the meetings of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, they used to sell the pictures of the scientists to the attendees, and it was very popular apparently at the time. Surab has a question. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ali. Oh, I wanted to ask a question regarding curses. Have you come across any curses by either the engravers or the lithographers in their signature? I'm asking this because I was reading the biography on a very famous engraver and a lithographer in 1890s, 1880s in Calcutta. So what happened was that he was in the middle of a engraving, he signed half of it, and then he left. When he came back, he saw it was finished. So eventually, whatever he produced, there used to be a little bit of curse in there. Whoever finishes this or whoever copies my sign, any one of my guild members, your nose will fall off, or you'll go blind, blah, blah, blah. So there are just curses all throughout all the wood engravings as well as the lithographic prints in almanacs from 1880s onwards. So I'm just asking, did you come across some curses or something like this? Because it led to more plagiarism, therefore, because anyway.
I've not come across curses, but I sort of, this article stops around 1860 when the carte de visite takes off, and actually that at that moment, I think lens-based media does take over the representation of celebrity and individuality, and actually the signed, you do sometimes get the signature underneath the photographic image, but it starts to die off, and I think it's a phenomenon of Romantic literary culture, this print portrait format. But no, that sounds really interesting, the curses. I'd love to hear more about it, I have to say.
That sounds really fascinating. And actually, it reminds me that in some of these journals, sometimes the publishers, when another journal copies something without referencing the journal, they don't curse them because legally it wasn't allowed, but they would lecture them and chastise them for kind of not giving credit where credit is due. And they were the first people to do this, and it's sort of written in response to whatever they were offended by in another journal. But it's interesting, like they're flat out curses. That sounds fun.
Thank you very much. Laura has a question as well.
Thank you. So I have a question, but the previous question actually reminded me of something. So yesterday I got a piece of sheet music from in my choir, which was published in 2020, and it's about the sort of text about the source of the cosmos. And at the bottom of each page, it says, "The source of the cosmos knows when you're photocopying." Which I just thought was amazing as like a twist on the paratext of like, don't, right? So anyway, this idea of a curse is also perhaps translated to the more contemporary use. So my question was for Tom about it was so exciting to sort of see this convention that I had seen so much, but to sort of think about it in a different way. So one of the things that I think about, one of the places I think about seeing that type of thing is in the frontispiece of a book, which may be extremely familiar and may have been written about. But I guess I was wondering how you think it changes in a periodical. Like how is it how does the meaning change in relation to the other things in the periodical, or even sort of like by the medium and the other things around it?
It's a really good question. I've been looking at these, and they pop up everywhere. So they're on, even sort of ephemera. They're on sometimes sheet music on the cover of sheet music. So I would be very interested to know, and this is just conjecture, if there's an attempt to somehow solidify or give a frame or to give some sort of architectonic surround to the portrait format if it's in a book compared to a periodical. The idea of the periodical being so associated with a periodicity and temporality that fits very well with the sort of the sketchy vignette, the sketch lithograph, and whether there's a difference in trying to stabilize the author of a book in the frontispiece. But I haven't actually made that comparison. I think it all ties into the fact that this is a portrait format deeply associated with the expansion of middle-class literary culture. So it's in the sorts of works that are being consumed by new middle-class publics as they emerge both in Europe and the Americas, but also in colonial contexts. But yeah, I'd be very interested to see if there is an attempt to maybe give us sort of more permanence to the portrait in the frontispiece compared to what are often quite sketchy images in periodicals. But I would have to do a bit more research to see if that's the case. But it's a really good question.
Can I just pop in? I see there's a question, but I just wanted to pop in. It seems to me that, periodicals are not only about periodicity and seriality, but about miscellaneity, which is, of course, what Hala talked a lot about. So what happens when you start to see these images with a riot of other, right? The excess of modernity is visuality, you said, Hala. So, when these sort of very personal things are in this in this ecosystem of miscellaneity, I think that seems like a really important piece. So, but anyway, there's another question, so I just wanted to throw in miscellaneity as another.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you. Before the other question, I just wanted to jump in because what Tom was saying and Laura's question also reminded me of some of the work that I'm doing that I didn't show, but it relates to portraiture as it appears in books. And that starts to appear in the late 1870s, but it's explicitly about sort of their posthumous portraits of authors. So earlier editions of that book didn't include an author portrait, but it's really about sort of also the sort of commercializing authorship and solidifying these ideas of who a public intellectual is. and having that image of the figure in the book, it's a way to sell these volumes, but it also establishes legitimacy and authority at a time when there's a lot of competition amongst presses. And so that's an interesting thing to think about, and a really good question that you raised, Laura.
Thank you very much. We have one more question. Renee, like to.
Okay, can you hear me now?
That's good.
Yes,
Yeah.
I hope. Yeah, hi. First of all, yeah, really interesting papers, and made me think of so many things. I have a question for Tom, and it's really a comment or a thought I had to some of your responses when you talked about, you know, the sort of literary culture and in the journals, and how surprised you are, or you know, to see the kind of the interest in the, you know, the scientists, etc. It just made me think, and in part I answered my question because we have this time difference, but it made me think of this huge popularity of self-help and the interest in the individual. And it wouldn't be the kind of literary individual necessarily, it would be the engineer, that kind of person, the self-made man, which was a hugely popular literature. Samuel Smiles obviously is the big name here. It's slightly later, but it kind of made me think of it, if there's a relationship, or maybe this tradition you've sketched out, which is a little bit earlier, carries on with that interest in the individual and the inspiring kind of ordinary man who rises to some kind of extraordinary status. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
No, I totally agree. I had to cut out quite a bit about that early ideas about the liberal self, but I think it ties into a whole range of ideas. One about the importance of agency, I think, in romantic and liberal conceptions of individuality, so that this is not just a representation of somebody entering the discursive literary sphere, a private person, and then becoming a public figure, but it's the act, so that the signature actually indexes the act of writing. And I think that links to ideas about agency in Germany, about Goethe and his idea of identity as this sort of inner volition that achieves a sort of teleological sense of fulfillment. In France, Victor Cousin is writing about the recognition of the self as this moment when you realize you have an inner volition. So I think all these ideas about agency are leading into this idea of the signature as evidence of agency, as opposed to just the physical representation of what you look like. And yet they tie into ideas about, I think what you're saying is maybe perhaps not so much the extraordinary individual, but even just this idea that there is, and each person has this individuality. The other point is ideas about the soul, but I think that's a whole other range of, I think that there's elements coming out of it as well, but that's too much to go into, I think.
Yeah, okay, great. When is the article coming out? I'd love to read it.
I think in October, but I'm not sure. It's been in press for a while.
Okay, great.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? We have it's 6:30 p.m. Here in France, but I don't know what time it is there where you are. And we have had a very interesting 1.5 hour. I don't know of your availability, so also if you want to stay longer and keep the conversation going, or if you want to leave. So I think probably it is time for most of us, but yeah.
I think we need to save Tom from heat exhaustion.
That's true as well. Yeah.
It is very hot in England. Yeah.
I know. I'm suffering too.
That's true. So let's not suffer further. And thank you very much, each and every one of you. Above all, to our speakers, Tom Young and Hala Auji, for their very interesting presentations. So yeah.
Thank you both so very, very much. And thank you all for coming. Really fantastic. And I hope we'll keep the conversation going, and I hope to see you both again in periodical studies events, because we do some really wonderful work. So thank you.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and thank you for such a great discussion as well. It was really useful.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.